In 1956, the British and French governments began preliminary discussions about a supersonic passenger aircraft. By the early 1960s, the project had a name Concorde and formal agreements had been signed between the two governments. By 1962, the project's estimated cost was £70 million. By the time Concorde entered commercial service in 1976, the total development cost had reached approximately £1.3 billion. The aircraft operated commercially until 2003. It never turned a profit. British Airways and Air France, the only two airlines that ever flew Concorde commercially, received their aircraft essentially as gifts from their respective governments, because no airline was willing to pay a market price for an aircraft whose operating economics didn't work. The reason it was built anyway is one of the clearest documented cases of institutional sunk cost behavior in history. By the mid-1960s, the British government had conducted internal assessments concluding that the project was unlikely to be commercially viable. The assessments were accurate. They were also set aside because by the mid-1960s, £100 million had already been spent, a treaty had been signed that contained no withdrawal clause, and the political cost of cancellation had grown in proportion to the investment already made. The British and French governments continued investing in Concorde, not because the analysis said it would succeed, but because the analysis of the cost of stopping had become entangled with the analysis of whether to stop. The question was no longer, should we build this? It was, can we afford not to finish what we started? Those are different questions. The second one produces a different answer. This is what sunk cost looks like when it's happening to you. Not an obvious logical error, but a gradual transformation of the decision question from a future-facing one, what is the best use of resources from here, into a past-facing one, what do we owe to what we've already done? The psychological research on sunk cost behavior is unambiguous and extensive. Humans systematically take into account prior costs that, by any normative theory of rational decision-making, should be irrelevant to current choices. The cost is already spent. Spending more will not recover it. The only relevant information for the current decision is what outcomes are available from this point forward, and what resources each of those outcomes requires. And yet, the person who has paid for a concert ticket will attend the concert in conditions that they would not willingly attend for free rein, illness, a prior commitment they'd prefer to keep. The company that has invested 3 years in a product will continue funding the product into its 4th year in conditions where a fresh evaluation of the same product would have produced a decision not to fund it at all. The individual who has been in a relationship for 5 years will stay in conditions they would not enter if the relationship were beginning now. The mechanism is documented across cultures, contexts, and levels of sophistication. Financial professionals are as susceptible as students. Organizations are more susceptible than individuals, because organizations have additional layers of social and political investment in prior decisions. The person who championed the original investment is still in the room, and their credibility is bound to the investment's continuation. This is the specific feature of organizational sunk cost behavior that makes it more dangerous than individual sunk cost behavior. The organizational environment creates social accountability to the past investment that the rational framework says should be irrelevant, and that social accountability is experienced as a real and legitimate consideration by the people who have it. Have you ever continued investing in something, a project, a product, a strategy past the point where a fresh assessment would have produced a different decision, specifically because of how much had already been invested? Leave a comment. Iridium is the corporate Concorde. In the late 1980s, a Motorola engineer named Barry Berdiger was on vacation in the Bahamas with his wife. She tried to make a phone call and couldn't get a connection. Berdiger had an idea. What if you could make a phone call from anywhere on Earth, using a network of low-orbit satellites? The idea became Iridium. By the time the satellite network was complete and operational in 1998, the project had cost approximately $5 billion. The network was technically extraordinary: 66 satellites in low Earth orbit, genuinely providing coverage everywhere on the planet. The service launched in November 1998. By March 1999, Iridium had filed for bankruptcy. The technology worked. The market analysis had been wrong. The system was designed in the late 1980s, before the explosive growth of terrestrial cellular networks, which, by 1998, covered most of the population centers that represented the market for mobile communications. The person who needed global satellite coverage in 1998 was not the executive traveling between major cities, who now had a cellular phone that worked. It was the polar researcher, the maritime operator, the military user segments that existed and were valuable, but that were much smaller than the original market analysis had assumed. The decision to continue the project through the early 1990s after terrestrial cellular began to make the market assumptions of the late 1980s clearly questionable reflects the same mechanism as Concorde. By the time the evidence of market misalignment was unambiguous, the sunk cost had become the primary fact in the room. Cancellation was not evaluated as stopping an investment that no longer makes sense. It was evaluated as abandoning $3 billion that has already been spent. Those are different calculations. The second one is the sunk cost fallacy in operation. If the specific mechanism how sunk cost transforms the question being asked is what makes this channel worth your time, the like is the direct signal. The employees who built Iridium, the engineers, the project managers, the operations staff were working on something genuinely impressive. The technical achievement of putting 66 satellites in low Earth orbit and coordinating them into a global communications network was real. The people who did that work did not make the market assumptions of the late 1980s that the project was built on, and they did not make the decisions in the early 1990s to continue, despite the emerging evidence that those assumptions were wrong. They showed up. They built an extraordinary thing. And when the project filed for bankruptcy 8 months after launch, what they had built $5 billion of satellite infrastructure was sold for approximately $25 million. The gap between $5 billion spent and $25 million recovered is the sunk cost fallacy's final balance sheet. The resources that could not be redirected to better uses, because the question being asked was not, what is the best use of these resources from here, but, how do we justify the resources already spent? Iridium's assets were eventually purchased, restructured, and relaunched as a smaller, focused business serving the maritime, military, and remote work markets that had always been its genuine addressable market. That business is profitable. It serves approximately 1.4 million subscribers. It generates the returns that the original project was trying to generate at 10 times the scale. The market that existed was always there. The company that could have served it profitably from the beginning would have required a fraction of the investment and could have been built if the original market assumptions had been revised when the evidence for revising them first became available, rather than after $5 billion had been spent on infrastructure scaled to assumptions that had already been disproven. The practical response to the sunk cost fallacy is the one that most people know: consider only future costs and future benefits. Treat past investment as irrelevant, and that most people find genuinely difficult to execute in the specific conditions where it matters. The conditions where it matters are the conditions where significant resources have already been committed, where the people in the room have personal and professional stakes in the prior investment, and where the question of whether to continue has been subtly transformed into a question of whether to abandon what has already been done. The two structural interventions address this at the organizational level. The first is the pre-commitment review. Before any major investment is made, define explicitly the specific conditions under which the investment would be canceled. Not general, if things aren't going well, language specific, measurable conditions. If the subscriber base has not reached X by date Y, or if the unit economics have not reached Z by end of Q3, these conditions define the investment's exit criteria before the sunk cost has accumulated. At the moment when the organization is best positioned to reason about future states rather than defending past ones. The second is the fresh start audit. At any point where a project's continuation is being evaluated, require an independent assessment by people who have no history with the project and no stake in its prior investment. The specific question: if we were evaluating this project today as a new proposal, With what we know about the market and the current state of the technology, would we fund it? If the answer is no, the sunk cost fallacy is operating. And the question being asked should change from, how do we justify continuing, to what is the least costly path to stopping in a way that preserves whatever genuine value has been created. The next episode looks at a failure that is structurally related, the confirmation bias that shapes how the evidence for continuing a project is evaluated after the original commitment has been made. This content was developed with the support of artificial intelligence tools and underwent human review, editorial curation, and approval before publication. The analysis presented here is strictly educational and philosophical in nature, grounded in behavioral psychology and classical stoicism.